When you've been married for as long as I had been, you learn to accept certain things about your partner. That's what I told myself, anyway. Maya and I were what you'd call opposites, complementary, if you were being kind about it. She had this energy, this spark for life that I admired, even if it could be a bit exhausting. Me? I'm the laid-back, steady-as-she-goes type. The type who likes things predictable, simple, and, frankly, quiet. Maya? Not so much. Take her hobbies, for instance. Maya wasn't the kind of person to collect stamps or knit scarves. No, she had to pick the most niche, most eccentric interest you could imagine. Last year, it was candle making. She turned our kitchen into a wax museum, spilling colored wax everywhere. Before that, it was soap carving, which I thought was fine, until I realized I couldn't use a single bar of soap in the house without ruining her art. But the one that really took the cake was her newest obsession, Japanese rope art, or as she liked to call it, shibari. Now, I'm not a prude. If Maya wanted to spend hours tying intricate knots and researching rope techniques, who was I to judge? I didn't exactly see the appeal, but hey, everyone needs a hobby. That's marriage, right? You give them space to be themselves, even when themselves involve ropes and knots that look like they belong in some kind of survivalist training. I wasn't into it, but I wasn't against it either. Maya had this way of getting completely lost in her interests. She'd spend hours watching tutorials, joining online forums, even ordering books from halfway across the world. When she found out there were workshops in our area, I figured, why not? Let her go, have fun. I'd hold down the fort and keep the house running smoothly. That was my role. Steady Liam, always practical, always supportive. It didn't bother me that I wasn't part of her hobbies. In fact, I kind of liked it that way. Some couples do everything together, but Maya and I thrived on having our own space. She'd dive headfirst into her creative projects, and I'd stick to my routine, work, gym, and an hour of TV before bed. We didn't always move in the same direction, but somehow, we kept walking side by side. So, when Maya announced her big idea, a costume party with a high school theme, I wasn't exactly surprised. This was classic Maya, big, bold, and full of enthusiasm. She wanted to recreate the feel of those teenage parties we all pretended to hate but secretly loved. Streamers, music, red solo cups, the whole nostalgic package. I have to admit, it sounded ridiculous to me. A bunch of grown adults pretending they were 17 again, but I could see how much it meant to her. She was practically glowing as she talked about it, jotting down ideas and planning every detail. That spark in her eye? It was impossible to say no to that. Sure, why not? I said, keeping my doubts to myself. I figured it'd be a harmless way for her to blow off steam, and maybe I'd even enjoy it. If I kept my expectations low. Maya threw herself into party planning like it was her job. She made lists, ordered decorations, even tracked down retro candy to match the theme. Meanwhile, I stayed in the background, watching her buzz around like a tornado of creativity. She asked me for one thing, to pick up the party supplies. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried shopping with one of Maya's lists, but let me tell you, it's an experience. Her lists weren't just lists. They were epic sagas, with notes, subcategories, and arrows pointing to optional items that weren't really optional. I swear, half the store staff thought I was stocking up for a small wedding, but I didn't complain. That's what you do for someone you care about, right? You show up. You handle the heavy lifting so they can do what makes them happy. That's what I told myself as I wrestled with a cart overflowing with streamers, balloons, and enough snacks to feed a football team. By the time I got home, Maya had already transformed our house into something out of a teenage rom-com. Streamers hung from the ceiling, a banner stretched across the living room, and music blared from the speakers. It was all a little overwhelming, but Maya looked so proud of herself that I couldn't help but smile. "Looks great," I said, setting down the bags. And it did, in its own chaotic way. That's the thing about marriage. Sometimes, you don't have to understand it. You just have to show up, do your part, and let your partner shine. And Maya? She was shining brighter than ever. The night of the party rolled around faster than I expected, and honestly, I wasn't ready. I mean, sure, I'd helped set up, bought the supplies, and even endured Maya's endless checklists, But nothing prepared me for the scene that greeted me when I walked out of our bedroom. Our living room, our quiet, comfortable living room, was unrecognizable. The decorations were everywhere. Balloons tied to every chair, streamers draped across the walls, and some retro neon lights Maya had found online flashing in a corner. She'd even managed to dig up an old karaoke machine, though I hadn't seen anyone actually use one since high school. And the people. My God, the people. At first, I thought I was hallucinating. I didn't recognize half of them. No, scratch that, more than half. Maya had said it would be a small party with close friends. Apparently, her definition of close friends included the entire tri-state area. People were spilling out of the kitchen, lounging in the hallway, even congregating near the front door like it was some sort of VIP club entrance. I tried to stay calm. This was Maya's thing, after all. If she was happy, then it was fine, right? But as I walked through the crowd, my unease started growing. There were strangers everywhere, talking, laughing, and drinking like they owned the place. Red plastic cups littered every surface, and I could hear someone loudly debating the merits of 80s music over 90s pop in the corner. Now, I'm not a party guy. Never have been. But I can usually fake it for a few hours, keep to the sidelines with a drink in hand, and let the night pass by. Tonight, though, something felt different. Off, even. I finally found Maya near the kitchen, laughing with a group of people I'd never seen before. She looked so in her element, so completely at ease, that I almost didn't want to interrupt. Almost. Hey, I said, stepping up beside her. Who are all these people? She waved it off, grinning. Just some friends of friends. You know how these things go. Did I? Because this didn't feel like the kind of party we'd ever thrown before. But Maya was having fun, and I didn't want to be the guy who ruined it. So I just nodded and backed away, retreating to the wall like the human equivalent of wallpaper. I grabbed a beer and settled in to watch the chaos unfold. People were playing beer pong in the kitchen, shouting every time someone missed. Someone else had cranked the music up loud enough that I could feel the bass vibrating in my chest. It was like being in a college dorm all over again, except this time, I was the old guy wondering what the hell he was doing there. Then I noticed something that really set me on edge. A group of guys in the living room had started getting rowdy. One of them, a tall, drunk guy I didn't recognize, was swaying on his feet, yelling at another guy I vaguely remembered from one of Maya's workshops. Their voices were rising, and it was clear that this wasn't going to end with a friendly handshake. I put my beer down and made my way over, already regretting it. Hey, let's calm it down, I said, stepping between them. Drunk guy glared at me, his face red and his fists clenched. What's your problem, man? I kept my voice steady. No problem. Just trying to keep the peace. For a second, I thought he was going to take a swing at me. But before he could, Maya appeared out of nowhere. She put a hand on his arm, smiling that disarming smile of hers, and started talking to him in a calm, soothing tone. I couldn't hear what she said over the music, but whatever it was, it worked. He nodded, mumbled something, and let her lead him out to the backyard. I stood there for a moment, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. Relief that the situation hadn't escalated. Frustration that this was even happening in my house. The rest of the night passed in a blur of noise and chaos. Maya seemed to be having the time of her life, flitting from group to group like a butterfly, while I stayed on the sidelines, nursing my beer and trying not to think too hard about how much I wanted everyone to leave. By the time the last guest finally stumbled out the door, it was well past midnight. The house was a mess. Empty cups, crushed chips, and confetti everywhere. Maya flopped onto the couch, looking exhausted but happy. Great party, huh? She said, her eyes shining. I just nodded, too tired to argue. But as I stood there, surveying the wreckage, I couldn't shake the feeling that this party wasn't just a one-time thing. It felt like the start of something different, and not necessarily in a good way. After the party, I thought things would settle back into their usual rhythm. Maya would dive headfirst into her next hobby, and I'd go back to my predictable routine of work, gym, and late-night TV. But that's not what happened. Something shifted after that night. It was subtle at first, so much so that I almost didn't notice it. Maya started spending more time on her phone, glued to the screen with this little smile on her face. It wasn't completely out of character. She'd always been a social butterfly, always had someone to chat with, but this was different. At first, I tried not to read too much into it. I mean, everyone's on their phone these days, right? But it wasn't just the phone. It was how distant she'd become. We'd sit on the couch together, her scrolling endlessly while I tried to watch TV, and it felt like she was a million miles away. "Who are you always texting?" I finally asked one evening, trying to keep my tone light. She looked up, startled, like she hadn't even realized I was there. "Oh, just a new friend," she said with a shrug. "Someone I met at one of the workshops." "A new friend?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah, she's into Sherbari too. We've been sharing ideas, techniques, stuff like that." That explanation should have put me at ease, but it didn't. There was something about the way she said it, too casual, too rehearsed, that made my stomach twist. Still, I didn't press the issue. I wasn't the type to interrogate her every move. At least, not yet. The late-night phone buzzes started not long after. I'd be half asleep when I'd hear the faint vibration of her phone on the nightstand. She'd pick it up immediately, her face lit by the glow of the screen. Sometimes she'd smile, a small, secretive smile that she probably didn't even realize she was making. "Who's texting you this late?" I asked once, trying to sound more curious than accusatory. "Just her," she said quickly. "You know how creative people are. Ideas come at weird hours." I nodded, pretending to accept that answer, but my gut was telling me something was off. Then came the evenings out. At first, it was just once in a while, a dinner here, a workshop there. But soon, it became a regular thing. Maya would leave the house dressed a little nicer than usual, saying she was meeting up with her friend to practice. She'd come home late, sometimes past midnight, and she always seemed too cheerful. The first couple of times, I convinced myself it was all innocent. She'd always been passionate about her hobbies, and I didn't want to be the guy who killed her joy. But by the third or fourth time, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. One night, she came home around 1 a.m., her cheeks flushed, her eyes bright. She kissed me on the cheek like nothing was wrong and started talking about some new knot they'd learned. I nodded along, pretending to listen, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story than she was letting on. "Is everything okay?" I asked her one evening, trying to keep my voice steady. "Of course," she said, laughing. "Why wouldn't it be?" I didn't have an answer for that, so I let it drop. But the doubts didn't go away. The turning point came one night when she left without much explanation. She didn't even say where she was going, just that she'd be out for a while. As I watched her walk out the door, a sinking feeling settled in my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I wanted to trust her. I wanted to believe that everything was as simple as she made it sound. But the late nights, the secretive texts, the glowing smiles, it all added up to something I couldn't ignore anymore. Eventually, I gave in to the temptation I'd been fighting for weeks. I reached over to her side of the bed and picked up her phone. My hands were shaking as I unlocked it, feeling like I was crossing a line I could never uncross. At first, it was all normal. Family group chats, messages from friends. But then I found the conversation. The one that stopped me cold. It wasn't a woman she'd been texting. It was a man. One of the strangers from the party. His name stood out immediately, a red flag waving right in my face. The messages started innocently enough, but as I scrolled further, my stomach turned. The way they talked, the things they said, it wasn't just friendly. My chest felt tight as I put the phone back down, careful not to wake her. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I wanted to believe there was some explanation, some way this wasn't what it looked like. But deep down, I already knew the truth. You know that moment when your worst suspicions are confirmed? When something you've been trying to deny suddenly smacks you in the face with undeniable clarity? Yeah, that was me the night everything fell apart. It had been a long day at work, and all I wanted was to come home, grab a cold beer, and sit in front of the TV. But the second I pulled into the driveway, I knew something was off. The house was too quiet. No lights in the living room, no music playing from the kitchen, None of the usual signs that Maya was bustling around. I shrugged it off at first, thinking maybe she'd gone out for another practice session with her mysterious friend. But as I stepped inside, the silence wasn't just quiet, it was unsettling. My gut tightened, that instinctual feeling that something wasn't right. I made my way down the hall, and that's when I heard it. Voices. Faint, muffled voices coming from the back room. A room we hardly ever used. My heart started pounding. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe Maya had some friends over. Maybe she was on the phone. But the closer I got, the clearer the voices became. Laughter, whispers, and something else I couldn't quite place. The door to the room was slightly ajar, and a dim light spilled out into the hallway. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Part of me didn't want to open it, didn't want to confirm what my gut was already screaming at me. But I couldn't stop myself. I pushed the door open, and what I saw froze me in place. There she was, Maya, tied up, hanging upside down, completely naked. And right next to her was him, the guy from the messages. The guy I told her to cut out of her life. He was just as naked as she was, and the sight of the two of them together, in my house, hit me like a freight train. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. The air felt thick, like I was moving through molasses. My vision narrowed until all I could see was the two of them. Rage bubbled up inside me, so intense it felt like it might tear me apart. I didn't think. I just moved. Before he even had a chance to react, I lunged at him, grabbing his arm and yanking him away from her. My fist connected with his face, and the sound of it was strangely satisfying. He stumbled back, crashing into the wall, but I didn't stop. I hit him again and again, every ounce of my anger pouring out with each punch. He tried to shield himself, tried to say something, but I didn't care. I wasn't listening. All I could see was red. Maya was screaming now, her voice frantic, but I barely registered it. My entire focus was on the man in front of me, the intruder in my home, the one who had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I grabbed him by the neck and dragged him toward the door. He was bleeding, his face a mess of bruises, but I didn't care. He deserved every bit of it. When we reached the front door, I shoved it open and threw him outside. He stumbled, nearly falling, and I stood there, my chest heaving, my fists still clenched. "If I ever see you again," I growled, my voice low and venomous, "I swear to God, I'll kill you." He didn't say anything. He just turned and ran, his bare feet slapping against the pavement as he disappeared into the night. I slammed the door shut, the sound echoing through the house, and turned back to face Maya. She was still there, hanging upside down, her eyes wide with shock and fear. "Untie me," she screamed, her voice breaking. I didn't move. I just stood there, staring at her, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. She had betrayed me, lied to me, brought this man into our home and into our marriage. Finally, I walked over and untied her, letting her fall to the floor in a heap. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears, and started to say something. An excuse, a plea, I don't know. But I wasn't interested in hearing it. I left the room and went straight to the bedroom. Grabbing a suitcase from the closet, I started throwing her clothes into it. My movements were sharp, mechanical, fueled by anger and adrenaline. Maya followed me, still crying, still begging me to listen. "It's not what it looks like," she said, her voice desperate. I turned to face her, my expression cold. "It's exactly what it looks like," I said, "and I'm done." I zipped up the suitcase and shoved it into her arms. "Take your things and get out." She stared at me, her face crumpling, but I didn't waver. "Go," I said, my voice firm, and she did. As the door closed behind her, I stood there in the silence, my chest tight but my mind clear. It was over. The lies, the betrayal, the marriage, it was all done. I had no idea what came next, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally in control. When Maya left that night, dragging her suitcase behind her, the house didn't feel like my home anymore. It felt like an empty shell, hollow and cold, filled with the echoes of what had just happened. I stood in the doorway for what felt like hours, staring at the spot where she'd been, trying to process it all. This was my life now. Alone, surrounded by the wreckage of a marriage I thought I understood. I didn't feel relief, not yet, anyway. What I felt was exhaustion. A deep, bone-crushing exhaustion that left me too tired to do anything but collapse onto the couch. The next morning, the house was still as silent as it had been the night before. I woke up to sunlight streaming through the windows, highlighting the chaos left behind. There were ropes on the floor, an overturned chair, and a few pieces of furniture knocked askew. It was like the physical remnants of the night were mocking me, daring me to ignore what had happened. But I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't shove it into the back of my mind and pretend it didn't exist. So, I did what I do best. I got to work. Cleaning the house became my way of coping. I picked up the ropes, coiled them neatly, and shoved them into a box I planned to throw out later. I righted the furniture, vacuumed the carpets, and wiped down every surface until they shone. Each small task felt like taking back a piece of myself, reclaiming the space that Maya had tainted. By the time I was done, the house looked spotless, but it still didn't feel like mine. It felt sterile, like a hotel room, neat, clean, and utterly devoid of personality. I stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the freshly cleaned floors, and felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Regret? Anger? Loss? I didn't know. All I knew was that the quiet was unbearable. A few days later, I decided to throw a small gathering. Nothing crazy, just a handful of close friends. People I trusted. I needed to remind myself that the world hadn't ended, that life could still go on. Setting up for the party felt strange. I couldn't help but think about the last time the house had been full of people, the chaos and noise, and how it had all gone so horribly wrong. But this was different. This time, it was my party, my rules, my people. When my friends arrived, the house came alive again. The quiet was replaced by laughter and conversation, the kind that didn't feel forced or fake. We sat around the living room, sharing drinks and stories, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. But of course, nothing in my life could stay peaceful for long. It started with a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone else, so I assumed it was a neighbor or someone who'd heard the music. I excused myself and went to answer it, my beer still in hand. When I opened the door, my stomach dropped. There she was, Maya, and right beside her, that bastard she'd brought into my house. Behind them stood a small group of people I didn't recognize, their faces a mix of curiosity and awkwardness. Maya looked at me with this defiant expression, like she had every right to be there, like nothing that had happened was her fault. I stared at them, the anger rising in my chest like a tidal wave. For a moment, I considered slamming the door in their faces, but then I thought better of it. I stepped aside, letting them in. My friends fell silent the second Maya walked into the living room, their eyes darting between me and her. The tension was palpable, thick enough to choke on. I walked over to where Maya and her entourage were standing, my voice low but firm. "You've got two options," I said, looking directly at her. "You can turn around and leave right now, or things are going to get real ugly, real fast." Her lover shifted uncomfortably, glancing around at the people watching. Maya opened her mouth to say something, but I cut her off. "I'm serious," I said, my tone ice cold. "You need to leave. Now." For a moment, she looked like she was going to argue, but something in my expression must have told her I wasn't bluffing. Her lover muttered something under his breath, pulling her toward the door. As they left, the weight in the room lifted. The air felt lighter, clearer, as though their presence had been poisoning it. My friends started talking again, their laughter a little louder now, like they were trying to fill the void left behind. I sat down, my hands still shaking from the adrenaline. Maya was out of my house again, but I knew this wasn't the end, not by a long shot. I never thought I'd find myself sitting in a courtroom, much less as a defendant. But there I was, surrounded by strangers, judge, jury, lawyers, all dissecting my life as if they had a right to it. It was surreal, like I was watching it all happen to someone else. The trial wasn't just about what happened at the party or the chaos that came after. It was about my entire life being picked apart, my intentions questioned, my actions scrutinized. The prosecution wanted to paint me as a violent man, a hothead who let his emotions get the better of him. My lawyer, on the other hand, argued that I was a man pushed to the brink, doing whatever it took to protect what was mine. Hearing them talk about me like that, like I was some abstract concept instead of a real person, was almost too much to bear. I wanted to stand up and yell, "You don't know me. You don't know what I've been through." But I didn't. I sat there, silent, my hands clasped tightly in front of me, waiting for my turn to be heard. The witnesses were called, one by one. My friends testified about the night of the party, about how Maya and her group had barged in, uninvited and unwelcome. They described the tension, the threats, and how I had tried to keep things civil until that man, Maya's lover, decided to push me too far. Their testimonies were a lifeline. They painted a picture of a man who had been provoked, who had acted out of necessity, not malice. I could see the jurors listening intently, some of them nodding along as my friends spoke. It gave me a glimmer of hope, a small light in an otherwise dark and suffocating room. But the prosecution wasn't going down without a fight. They tried to twist my friend's words, to make it seem like I had been the aggressor all along. They even brought up my confrontation with Maya's lover after I discovered her betrayal, framing it as evidence of a violent temper. I clenched my fists under the table, trying to keep my composure. They weren't wrong. I had been angry, furious even. But who wouldn't be in my position? How could they expect me to just sit back and let it all happen without fighting back? Then came the moment I had been dreading. Maya took the stand. She looked different, worn down, tired. Like the weight of everything had finally caught up with her. She didn't look at me as she spoke, her eyes focused on the lawyer asking the questions. She admitted that she and her lover had come to the party uninvited, but she downplayed the confrontation, making it seem like I had overreacted. It stung, hearing her twist the truth like that, but at the same time, I couldn't bring myself to hate her. I was angry, sure, but there was a part of me that still pitied her, that still saw the woman I had loved and wondered how we had ended up here. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up, took a deep breath, and told my side of the story. I didn't sugarcoat anything. I admitted to my anger, to my mistakes, but I also made it clear that I had been pushed to my limit. I described the betrayal, the uninvited intrusion, and the threat I felt when that man confronted me in my own home. "I'm not a violent man," I said, my voice steady but firm, "but I'm not a man who will stand by and let someone disrespect my home, my life, and everything I've worked for." I could see the jurors watching me, their expressions thoughtful, some even sympathetic. It was a small comfort, but it was enough to keep me going. The waiting was the hardest part. The hours stretched into days as the jury deliberated, each second feeling like an eternity. I tried to distract myself, but it was no use. All I could do was replay everything in my head, over and over again, wondering if I could have done something differently. When the verdict finally came, my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. "Not guilty," the foreman said, and just like that, the weight lifted off my chest. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, the relief washing over me in waves. The judge banged the gavel, and it was over. As I walked out of that courtroom, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, yes, but also exhaustion. The trial might have ended, but the scars it left behind would take much longer to heal. Maya didn't look at me as I passed her on the way out. She just sat there, staring at the table in front of her, her face pale and drawn. I didn't say anything to her. There was nothing left to say. When I got home that night, the house was quiet again, but it felt different this time. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating quiet of before. It was peaceful, almost comforting. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. The trial was over, but my life wasn't. I still had a lot to figure out, a lot to rebuild. But as I sat on the couch, staring at the empty room around me, I knew one thing for sure. I was free. The days after the trial felt strange. Not in a bad way, just different, like I was stepping into a world I hadn't really noticed before. The weight that had been pressing down on me for months was gone, but in its place was an unfamiliar quiet. It wasn't the same eerie silence that had haunted me after Maya left. This was the quiet of possibility. I'd wake up in the mornings and realize I could breathe again, that my chest didn't feel tight and my mind wasn't racing with anger or suspicion. The house, empty as it was, started to feel like a blank slate instead of a reminder of everything I'd lost. But even with the newfound freedom, I wasn't naive enough to think I'd completely moved on. The scars of betrayal don't just vanish overnight. Every time I looked at the couch or the kitchen table, I'd catch myself thinking about her, about us, and how things went so wrong. Those thoughts didn't last as long as they used to, though. They were like faint echoes, fading faster each day. It was during one of those quieter days that I met Sophia. A mutual friend had invited me to a small dinner gathering, nothing fancy, just a few people catching up over food and wine. I almost didn't go. The idea of socializing still felt like a chore, and I wasn't sure I had the energy to sit through conversations about jobs, kids, and all the other things I wasn't ready to think about. But something pushed me to say yes. Maybe it was the idea of being around people who didn't know the full extent of my mess, or maybe it was just the promise of a decent meal that I didn't have to cook myself. Whatever it was, I showed up, and that's when I saw her. Sophia wasn't flashy or loud like Maya. She had this quiet confidence about her, the kind of presence that didn't demand attention but somehow drew it anyway. She was warm, kind, and completely unlike anyone I'd met in a long time. We ended up sitting next to each other during dinner, and before I knew it, we were talking. Really talking. Not the polite, surface-level small talk I'd expected, but actual conversation. She asked me about myself, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel the need to hold back. I told her about the divorce. Not the messy details, just the broad strokes. She listened, her eyes never leaving mine, and when I finished, she didn't pity me or try to offer advice. She just nodded and said, "That must have been hard." That was it. No judgment, no awkward sympathy, just understanding. After that night, we started seeing each other more. It wasn't anything dramatic or rushed. We took things slow, meeting for coffee or lunch, talking about everything and nothing. With Sophia, there were no games, no lies, no second-guessing. It was easy, and I hadn't realized how much I needed easy until then. Of course, Maya wasn't completely out of the picture. She'd started reaching out again, texting and calling under the guise of checking in. At first, I ignored her, letting her messages go unanswered. But when she started leaving voicemails about wanting to talk things through, I knew I had to set some boundaries. One afternoon, I picked up the phone and told her, plain and simple, that there was nothing left to discuss. "I've moved on," I said, my voice firm but calm. "You need to do the same." She didn't take it well. She cried, accused me of being heartless, said she'd made a mistake and wanted to fix things. But I didn't let her guilt me into anything. I'd spent enough time living in her chaos. I wasn't going back. Sophia knew about Maya, of course. I'd been honest with her from the start, and she never once made me feel like my past was something to be ashamed of. When I told her about Maya's attempts to reconnect, she just smiled and said, "She's trying to hold on to something that's already gone." She was right. Maya had lost her chance, and no amount of tears or apologies was going to change that. Being with Sophia felt like a fresh start. She didn't try to fix me or pretend like she had all the answers. She just showed up, day after day, and reminded me what it felt like to be seen, really seen, by someone who cared. We started building something together. Something small and simple, but ours. It wasn't about filling the void Maya had left behind. It was about creating something new. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living, and for that, I was grateful. Just when I thought I'd finally put Maya behind me, she reminded me why moving on was necessary in the first place. It started one morning when I stepped outside to head to work. The crisp air felt refreshing, and I was in a surprisingly good mood for a Monday. But then I saw it. My car, parked in the driveway, was ruined. A long, jagged scratch ran along the entire side of it. It wasn't subtle, either. Deep gouges that cut through the paint, exposing the metal beneath. Whoever had done it wanted to make sure it couldn't be ignored. I stood there, staring at the damage, my fists clenching at my sides. There was no doubt in my mind who was responsible. Maya. It had her signature spite written all over it. For a moment, I debated letting it go. Maybe it wasn't worth the trouble. But then I remembered all the nights I'd spent questioning my sanity, all the times I'd given her the benefit of the doubt only to be betrayed again. No, this wasn't something I could let slide. I went back inside, pulled up the security footage from the cameras I'd installed after she left, and there she was, clear as day, creeping up to my car in the dead of night. Her face wasn't fully visible, but it was her. I'd know her posture, her movements, anywhere. She took her time, too, running a sharp object, probably a key, along the length of the car, step by methodical step. When she was done, she stood back and admired her work before disappearing into the shadows. I couldn't stop watching the footage, anger boiling in my chest. She hadn't just vandalized my car. She'd crossed yet another boundary. She couldn't stand the idea that I was moving on, that I was happy without her. So she had to insert herself into my life again. But this time, I wasn't going to let her get away with it. That evening, I sat down with Sophia and showed her the footage. "What do you think I should do?" I asked, already knowing what I wanted to hear. She didn't hesitate. "You need to hold her accountable," she said firmly. "She can't keep doing this to you." So, I decided to set a trap. The next day, I called Maya. She answered on the first ring, her voice cautious at first, but quickly shifting to hopeful when I told her I wanted to talk. "I've been thinking about things," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Maybe we rushed into ending things. Can we meet and talk?" Her excitement was palpable. "Of course," she said eagerly. "When?" "Come over tonight," I said, masking the satisfaction in my voice. She showed up promptly, her face lit with anticipation as I led her inside. I played my part perfectly, telling her I'd been reconsidering everything, that I missed her, and that I wanted to make things work. She lapped it up, her smile growing wider with every word. Then came the knock at the door. Her smile faltered as I opened it, revealing 2 police officers standing on my porch. Confusion turned to panic as I stepped aside to let them in. "What's going on?" she stammered, her voice trembling. I didn't say a word. Instead, I picked up the remote and played the security footage on the TV. The sound of her key scratching my car filled the room as the video looped on screen. Her face went pale. "This isn't what it looks like," she said, desperation creeping into her voice. "It's exactly what it looks like," I replied coldly. The officers didn't need much convincing. They stepped forward, cuffing her as she shouted at me, her voice a mix of anger and betrayal. "You set me up," she screamed. "No," I said evenly. "You did this to yourself." As they led her out of the house, she kept yelling, hurling every insult she could think of at me. But I didn't care. For the first time, I felt like I was finally free of her. In the weeks that followed, Maya faced legal consequences for the vandalism. She was ordered to pay for the damage to my car, and a restraining order ensured she couldn't come near me again. It wasn't about revenge. It was about drawing a line, making it clear that I wasn't going to let her disrupt my life anymore. Sophia and I decided it was time for a fresh start. We found a new place, something smaller, cozier, and free of the memories tied to Maya. Moving in felt like shedding an old skin, like stepping into a new chapter that was entirely ours. As I unpacked boxes and watched Sophia arrange books on a shelf, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. The chaos, the betrayal, the anger. It was all behind me now. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was living, and I was ready to embrace whatever came next. Moving into the new house was like stepping into a whole new world. It wasn't just a physical change. It felt symbolic, like I was leaving the wreckage of my old life behind and finally stepping into something better. The house was smaller than the last one, but it had charm. More importantly, it was ours, mine and Sophia's, a fresh start free of the shadows Maya had cast. As we unpacked, I found myself marveling at how easy things felt with Sophia. There were no mind games, no hidden motives, just 2 people working together, laughing over misplaced kitchen utensils and debating where to hang the artwork. For the first time in years, my home felt like a sanctuary instead of a battlefield. Sophia had a way of making everything feel lighter. She'd hum while she worked, dance around the living room when a song she loved came on, and somehow turn even the most mundane tasks into something fun. She didn't try to force me to talk about my past, but she listened when I needed to. One evening, as we sat on the couch surrounded by half-empty boxes, she leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "You're different here." "What do you mean?" I asked, turning to look at her. "You seem lighter. Happier," she said, smiling softly. "Like you're finally breathing again." She was right. For the first time in a long time, I felt like myself. Not the version of me that had been consumed by anger and betrayal, but the person I used to be before everything went wrong. Of course, the ghosts of the past didn't disappear entirely. Every now and then, I'd catch myself thinking about Maya, about the good times, before it all fell apart. I didn't miss her, not really, but there was a part of me that still wondered how we'd ended up so broken. Sophia understood that, too. She never got jealous or insecure when those thoughts surfaced. Instead, she reminded me, in her quiet, steady way, that I was allowed to feel conflicted. That healing wasn't a straight line, and it was okay to carry a little baggage as long as I didn't let it weigh me down. The neighborhood was another blessing. Unlike the chaos of our old place, this one was peaceful. The kind of place where kids played in the street. Neighbors waved hello, and everything seemed to move a little slower. It was exactly what I needed. A chance to build something steady, something real. One Saturday, while Sophia was out running errands, I found myself sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee, staring out at the yard. It wasn't much, just a small patch of grass and a few trees, but it felt like paradise compared to the turmoil I'd left behind. As I sat there, I thought about everything I'd been through. The betrayal, the trial, the endless nights of questioning myself and my choices. It had been hell, but it had also been a lesson. I'd learned what I was willing to fight for, what I deserved, and what I wouldn't tolerate ever again. I'd also learned the value of patience, of waiting for something real instead of clinging to something toxic out of fear or habit. Sophia was proof of that. She wasn't just someone I could build a life with. She was someone who made me want to be better, someone who reminded me that love didn't have to hurt. Later that day, she came home with a bag full of groceries and an idea. "Let's host a dinner," she said, her eyes lighting up. "A dinner?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah, just a small one," she said. "Nothing fancy. I think it'd be nice to celebrate this new chapter." At first, I hesitated. Hosting had always been Maya's thing, and the idea of opening our home to others felt strange. But then I looked at Sophia, saw the excitement in her face, and realized this wasn't about the past. This was about creating new memories, new traditions. So we did it. We invited a few close friends, cooked a simple but delicious meal, and spent the evening laughing and talking around the dining table. It wasn't extravagant, but it didn't need to be. It was warm, genuine, and exactly what I'd been missing for so long. As the night wound down and the guests left, I stood in the kitchen with Sophia, washing dishes and thinking about how far I'd come. The house wasn't just a place to live. It was a symbol of everything I'd fought for. When we finished cleaning up, I wrapped my arms around Sophia and held her close. "Thank you," I whispered. "For what?" she asked, looking up at me with a smile. "For being here," I said. "For making everything feel right again." She kissed me softly, her hands resting on my chest. "You deserve it," she said simply. And for the first time in a long time, I believed her.